Hi.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Samuel, and I want to talk with you today about something I've observed over nearly 4 decades of practicing medicine, something that becomes clearer to me with each passing year. There's a quiet disconnect happening in how we think about health after the age of 60, and it's not what most people expect to hear. This isn't about major diseases or sudden health crises. This is about the small things, the daily things, the habits we've built up over decades that we believe are protecting us, when in reality, they may be working against the way our bodies have changed. I've had the privilege of working with thousands of patients in their 60s, 70s, and beyond, and one thing strikes me again and again. So many people are doing what they've always been told is right, what worked for them at 40 or 50, and they can't quite understand why they feel more tired, why their joints ache more, why sleep has become difficult, why they feel a persistent low-grade exhaustion that wasn't there before. And when we sit down and really talk, when we go through their day step by step, we often find that the very habits they're most proud of, the ones they're most committed to, are the ones that need the gentlest reconsideration. Let me start with something I see almost every week in my practice. A patient comes in, usually someone very dedicated to their health, and they tell me about their exercise routine. They're up early, they're at the gym, they're pushing themselves hard, because they've heard that staying active is the key to healthy aging. And they're right about that, of course. Movement is essential. But what I've learned from watching this unfold over the years is that somewhere around 60, the body stops responding to exercise the way it once did. The recovery time lengthens, the inflammation lingers. The stress hormones that exercise naturally produces don't clear out of the system as quickly. And yet, we keep pushing at the same intensity, with the same frequency, because we've been told that more is better, that we need to fight against aging, that slowing down means giving up. I had a patient, a man in his late 60s, a former marathon runner, who came to see me because he couldn't shake a persistent fatigue. He was still running 5 days a week, still pushing for speed, still treating his body like it was 40. When I suggested that his running routine might actually be contributing to his exhaustion rather than preventing it, he looked at me like I'd suggested he stop breathing. But we made some changes, not dramatic ones, just thoughtful ones. We reduced the frequency, we slowed the pace, we added rest days. Within 2 months, his energy had returned, his sleep improved. The chronic achiness in his knees and hips began to fade. He wasn't doing less, really. He was doing what his body at 68 needed, not what his body at 48 had needed. This is one of those quiet truths about aging that doesn't get talked about enough. After 60, recovery becomes more important than the exercise itself. The body doesn't bounce back overnight anymore. Inflammation, which is a natural response to physical stress, used to resolve in hours. Now it can take days. Microscopic muscle tears that used to repair themselves quickly now take longer to heal. And if we're exercising intensely, day after day, without adequate rest, we're essentially asking the body to repair itself while we keep adding new damage. Over time, this creates a state of chronic, low-grade inflammation that affects everything from joint pain to sleep quality to mental clarity to digestive function. And it's not just about intensity, it's about variety, or rather, the lack of it. I see so many people who found an exercise they love, something they've been doing for years, and they stay with it exclusively, walking the same route every day, using the same machines at the gym, swimming the same laps. And while consistency has value, the body after 60 needs something different. It needs varied movement, unpredictable movement, movement that challenges balance and coordination and flexibility in different ways. When we do the same motion over and over, year after year, we strengthen certain muscles and certain movement patterns while others weaken. This creates imbalances that, over time, affect how we move through everyday life, how stable we feel, how easily we recover from a stumble. There's something else about exercise that I think gets missed in the conversation about healthy aging. We tend to think of it as something we do, an activity we engage in, and then stop. But the human body wasn't designed for that kind of segmentation. For most of human history, movement was woven throughout the day, varied and natural and responsive to need. Now we compress all our movement into an hour at the gym and then sit, often very still, for most of the remaining waking hours. And this pattern, this idea of exercising intensely and then being sedentary, may actually be harder on an aging body than we realize. The research on this is fascinating and honestly, a bit sobering. Long-term studies have shown that periods of prolonged sitting, even in people who exercise regularly, create their own set of problems. Blood flow slows. Muscles become less responsive to insulin. The discs in the spine compress. The hip flexors tighten. And because we're often sitting in what we think of as good posture, very upright, very controlled, we're actually creating a different kind of stress. The muscles of the back and neck work constantly to hold that position, never fully relaxing, and over time, this sustained tension contributes to stiffness and discomfort that people often attribute to aging itself, not to the way they're sitting. I've started asking my patients to think less about posture and more about position change. The body needs variety, not rigidity. It needs to shift, to lean, to move, to rest in different configurations throughout the day. When I suggest this, I often hear, "But my doctor told me to sit up straight, to keep my shoulders back." And yes, collapsed, rounded sitting isn't good either. But there's a middle path, a more intuitive way of being in the body that allows for natural shifts and adjustments, rather than holding one supposedly correct position for hours on end. Let me shift to something that surprises almost everyone when I bring it up, and that's hydration. We've been told for years, drink more water, 8 glasses a day, stay hydrated, dehydration is dangerous, and certainly adequate fluid intake is important. But I've noticed a pattern in my older patients, especially those who are very conscientious about their health. They're drinking water constantly, all day long, sometimes far more than their body actually needs. And this creates its own problems that are rarely discussed. The kidneys, like every other organ, age. They become less efficient at concentrating urine, less able to hold onto sodium and other electrolytes. When we drink excessive amounts of water, especially plain water, without adequate minerals, we can actually dilute the electrolyte balance in our blood. This condition, which we call hyponatremia, doesn't usually happen dramatically. It happens gradually, subtly. People feel a little more fatigued. They feel a little dizzy when they stand. They notice muscle weakness or cramping. Their thinking feels foggy. And because these symptoms are vague and gradual, they get attributed to aging or to not drinking enough water, which leads to drinking even more, which worsens the problem. I'm not suggesting people shouldn't stay hydrated. I'm suggesting that after 60, hydration needs to be more intuitive and less prescriptive. Thirst is actually a remarkably reliable guide for most people. If you're thirsty, drink. If you're not, you probably don't need to force fluids. And if you are drinking water throughout the day, consider that the minerals matter too. The body needs sodium, potassium, magnesium. When we drink only plain water, especially in large quantities, we can wash these out faster than we replace them. This brings me to another habit I see frequently, and that's the morning routine so many people have adopted. They wake up often earlier than their body naturally wants to wake, and they immediately start the day with a series of activities they believe are healthy. A large glass of water on an empty stomach, maybe some lemon water, then coffee, often multiple cups, then exercise, sometimes intense exercise, all before breakfast. And they feel virtuous about this, like they're winning the day, taking control of their health. But what I've observed over the years is that this kind of routine can be particularly stressful for an aging body. When we wake, cortisol is naturally elevated. It's part of the body's wake-up system. When we add caffeine, we spike it higher. When we add intense exercise, we spike it higher still. And when we do all of this without food, without giving the body any fuel or nutrients, we're essentially running on stress hormones for the first several hours of the day. In a younger body, this might be manageable. But after 60, when the adrenal glands are less resilient, when blood sugar regulation is less stable, when the body's ability to buffer stress is diminished, this pattern can contribute to that feeling of being wired and tired at the same time, that sense of running on empty, even though you're doing everything right. I've had patients who, when they shifted their morning routine, when they ate something small before exercising, when they reduced their coffee intake or moved it to later in the morning, when they allowed themselves to wake more gradually, experienced a shift in how they felt throughout the entire day. More steady energy, better mood stability, improved digestion, better sleep at night. These aren't dramatic interventions. They're subtle adjustments that acknowledge how the body's needs have changed. And speaking of digestion, this is another area where I see well-intentioned habits that don't serve aging bodies well. There's been so much emphasis in recent years on eating less, on intermittent fasting, on restricting calories as a path to longevity and health. And while there's interesting research in this area, what I see in my practice is that many older adults have taken this too far. They're eating one meal a day, or they're fasting for 16, 18, even 20 hours. And they're doing this at a time in life when the body actually needs consistent, adequate nutrition to maintain muscle mass, bone density, cognitive function, and immune resilience. The metabolism does slow with age, that's true. But the need for protein doesn't decrease. The need for vitamins and minerals doesn't decrease. In fact, in many ways, nutritional needs become more demanding because absorption becomes less efficient. The stomach produces less acid. The gut produces fewer digestive enzymes. The intestinal lining becomes more permeable and less selective about what it lets through. And when we're eating very infrequently, or eating very small amounts, or restricting entire food groups based on the latest dietary trend, we risk not getting what we actually need. I've seen this play out in subtle ways. Patients come in complaining of weakness, of difficulty building or maintaining muscle, even though they're exercising, of brittle nails, thinning hair, poor wound healing, frequent infections. And when we look at their diet, they're often eating far too little protein, far too infrequently, distributed in a way that doesn't support muscle synthesis. The body, after 60, seems to need protein more regularly throughout the day, not saved up for one large meal. It needs it in amounts that would have seemed excessive at 40, but are actually appropriate now. There's also this tendency, and I say this gently because it comes from a good place, to make food very complicated, to follow strict rules about what can be combined, what should be eaten at what time, what should never be eaten together, to avoid entire categories of food based on information that may not apply to everyone or that may have been taken out of context. I've met people who have so many food rules that eating has become a source of stress rather than nourishment. And stress, chronic stress, affects digestion profoundly. It shunts blood away from the digestive system. It reduces enzyme production. It alters gut motility. Over time, this can create or worsen the very digestive problems people are trying to avoid through their dietary restrictions. What I often suggest is a return to simpler eating, whole foods, prepared simply, eaten when hungry, stopped when satisfied. Enough protein at each meal to support the body's needs, enough variety to ensure a range of nutrients, less rigidity about rules and more attention to how foods make you feel, how your body responds, what gives you energy and what depletes it. This kind of intuitive approach requires trust, though, and I find that many people have lost trust in their body signals after years of following external rules and guidelines. Sleep is another area where I see patterns that concern me. So many of my patients are not sleeping well, and when we talk about it, they have all these strategies they've implemented to try to fix it. They go to bed at the same time every night, regardless of whether they're tired. They stay in bed for 8 or 9 hours, even if they're awake for much of it, because they've been told they need that much sleep. They avoid naps during the day, no matter how exhausted they feel, because they've heard naps will ruin nighttime sleep. They keep their bedroom very dark, very quiet, very cool. They avoid screens for hours before bed. They take melatonin or magnesium or other supplements, and yet they're still not sleeping well. What I've come to understand is that sleep architecture changes with age. The deep, consolidated sleep of youth doesn't typically continue into the later decades. Sleep becomes lighter, more fragmented, more easily disturbed. And this is normal. It's not pathological. But we've created this expectation that sleep should look the same at 70 as it did at 30, and when it doesn't, we see it as a problem to be solved rather than an adaptation to accept and work with. The body after 60 often needs less total sleep time, or it needs sleep distributed differently. Perhaps a shorter night with a daytime rest period. Perhaps a more flexible schedule that honors natural energy patterns rather than forcing a rigid routine. When I suggest to patients that they might benefit from a short afternoon rest, or that they might try going to bed when they're actually sleepy rather than at a prescribed time, or that they might get up if they've been awake for more than 20 minutes rather than lying there anxious and frustrated, they often look surprised. But many of them find that when they stop fighting their body's natural rhythms, sleep actually improves. There's something else about sleep that doesn't get talked about enough, and that's the relationship between daytime activity and nighttime rest. I mentioned earlier how many people compress all their movement into a short period and then are very sedentary for the rest of the day. This pattern affects sleep in ways we're only beginning to understand. The body seems to need varied, distributed movement throughout the day to sleep well at night. Not intense exercise necessarily, but movement. Changes in position, shifts in activity level. Time spent outside, exposed to natural light, which helps regulate the circadian rhythm in ways that artificial light cannot replicate. I've had patients whose sleep improved dramatically, not because they changed anything about their bedtime routine, but because they started taking short walks after meals, or standing and moving for a few minutes every hour, or spending time outside in the morning. These small changes, cumulative over weeks and months, seem to help the body differentiate between day and night, between activity and rest, in a way that supports more natural sleep patterns. And then there's the mind, the cognitive habits, the mental patterns that we've developed over a lifetime and rarely think to examine. I see so many people who pride themselves on staying mentally sharp, on keeping their mind active, on continuing to multitask and manage complex schedules and stay constantly engaged with news and information and communication. And while mental engagement is certainly important, what I've observed is that the aging brain, like the aging body, may need a different kind of stimulation than it once did. The brain after 60 is still capable of remarkable things, of learning and creativity and insight. But it processes information differently. It tires more easily from sustained focus. It becomes more easily overwhelmed by multiple simultaneous demands. And when we push it the way we did at 40, when we try to maintain the same pace, the same level of multitasking, the same constant connectivity, we can create a state of cognitive fatigue that affects everything from memory to decision-making to emotional regulation. I often talk with my patients about the difference between stimulation and stress. Reading a challenging book is stimulation. Learning a new skill is stimulation. Having a deep conversation is stimulation. But being constantly interrupted by notifications, trying to follow multiple conversations at once, consuming a steady stream of fragmented information, this is stress masquerading as engagement. And the aging brain seems to be more sensitive to this distinction, more quickly depleted by the latter. What I suggest, and what seems to help, is intentional simplicity in mental activity, doing one thing at a time, fully, with attention. Building in periods of genuine rest, not just sleep but wakeful rest, time when the mind isn't being directed or entertained or stimulated, time for reflection and integration. This might sound like a luxury, but I've come to believe it's actually a necessity for cognitive health as we age. The brain needs space to consolidate memory, to process information, to repair itself. And we're not giving it that space when we fill every moment with input and activity. There's one more pattern I want to mention, and it's perhaps the most subtle and the most significant. I've noticed that many people, as they move into their 60s and beyond, begin to isolate themselves socially, not necessarily because they want to, but because they've absorbed this cultural message about independence and self-sufficiency. They don't want to burden others, they don't want to seem needy, they take pride in managing everything themselves, in not asking for help, in maintaining their autonomy. And while independence has value, what the research clearly shows is that social connection, genuine social connection, is one of the most powerful predictors of healthy aging. Not just any social contact, but meaningful relationships, people you can talk to honestly, people who know you well, people you see regularly in person, not just through screens. The data on this is striking. Social isolation affects mortality risk as much as smoking. It affects cognitive decline, immune function, cardiovascular health, even pain perception. And yet, so many of the people I see are becoming progressively more isolated, often without fully recognizing it, because they're still busy, still active, still connected digitally, but lacking the kind of deep, regular, in-person connection that the aging body and mind seem to need. When I bring this up with patients, they often acknowledge it, but don't quite know what to do about it. Friendships have faded. Family is far away or busy. Old social structures like work have ended. And building new connections at this stage of life can feel awkward or difficult. But I encourage them to think of it as important as any other health habit, something worth prioritizing and investing in, not as a nice addition to life, but as a fundamental requirement for well-being. So, where does this leave us, after all these observations about habits and patterns that don't serve us as well as we might hope? I want to be clear about something. None of this is about perfection. None of this is about getting it all right. What I'm really talking about is awareness, the willingness to question whether the habits we've built over decades are still serving us, the openness to adjust and adapt as our bodies and minds change, the courage to let go of what we've always done in favor of what we actually need now. Aging well isn't about fighting against age or denying change or maintaining the same routines and intensity we had at 40. It's about alignment, about bringing our daily choices into alignment with who we are and what our bodies need at this stage of life. It's about listening more carefully, trusting our own experience, being willing to experiment and adjust, letting go of rigid rules in favor of intuitive wisdom. The body is remarkably resilient, even at 60, 70, 80, and beyond. It wants to heal, to balance, to function well. But it needs us to work with it, not against it. It needs us to respect its changing needs, to honor its signals, to give it what it actually requires, rather than what we think it should require. And often, that means doing less, simplifying, resting more, being gentler, moving in more varied and natural ways, eating more intuitively, sleeping more flexibly, connecting more deeply, thinking more spaciously. These aren't dramatic changes. They're quiet adjustments, subtle shifts in how we move through each day. But over time, cumulatively, they can make the difference between aging with vitality and ease versus aging with chronic discomfort and diminishing capacity. The choice, to whatever extent we have control over these things, is ours. And it begins with awareness, with questioning our assumptions, with being willing to see our habits clearly and make thoughtful changes when they no longer serve us. That's what I've learned over all these years of working with people navigating this stage of life. And that's what I hope you'll take with you as you consider your own path forward. This video contains health-related information created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. If you believe you may have a medical concern, we recommend consulting a qualified medical professional.